Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Intro to Philosophy. So last week we talked about free will, and stick that behind you. Stick a pin in that for a second. We'll come back to the issue of free will. We're going to change for this week and next week. We're going to swing back around to free will later on, but the topic is going to change this week. To what's called the problem of evil. The problem of evil is a question in the philosophy of religion, and it's the question of why does God allow suffering, right? So if you're familiar with the Western idea of God, the idea of the Judeo-Christian God, for instance, also the Islamic God. There's this idea that such a God is all-powerful and perfectly good. And yet the world that we see around us does not seem to reflect the kind of world that a perfectly good, perfectly benevolent, that is loving God would create. In other words, we are surrounded by all different kinds of suffering. People suffer terribly. People suffer terribly for reasons because they hurt each other, and there are what are called moral crimes. There is also a thing called what's called in this discussion natural evil, which is the suffering that results as from natural events in the world, from hurricanes and earthquakes and natural diseases and so on, right? So just as we go forward in this discussion on the problem of evil, the question of why does God allow suffering, I want to make a bit of terminology clearer. First of all, we're going to use the words suffering and evil interchangeably here, right? A lot of people have pointed out this really should be called the problem of suffering because evil comes with these other sorts of meanings and baggage, but the problem is just called the problem of evil. So, and we're just going to refer to it that just in this conversation, just remember that evil means suffering. So, we're going to take two passes at this problem of evil. Our first pass at this problem of evil is going to be informal. That's going to be today. That's from Fyodor Dostoyevsky. And our next pass at it is going to be much more formal and logically rigorous, and that's going to be from the Australian logician J.L. Mackie, right? So, for an informal introduction for today, we turn to the chapter that we read for today. You might have noticed that it's a little different and very different in a few ways from the chapters that you've read at other times in this lecture. The other chapters we've read for this lecture have been articles from you might find published in a philosophy journal or in a historical philosophy book. This chapter, however, is a chapter from a novel. It's a very famous novel, a Russian novel, called The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. He's a great Russian novelist, maybe the greatest novelist of all time, if you ask people like me. And I want to encourage you that if you liked this chapter, if you like where it goes and you like the discussion between these two brothers, I very, very highly recommend that you go out and you seek the rest of this novel and read it. The novel itself, I'll take a brief moment to advertise for the rest of the novel. The novel itself is really a book-length treatment of this problem of evil. That might make it sound a little dry, but it's not really dry. I mean, if you like to read, if you can get into 19th century literature, and you like long novels, this is about 800 pages total. What we read for today is just like 10 pages out of an 800-page novel. But if you like this chapter, you should go out and you should seek out the brothers Karamazov and read the rest of it. The rest of the book is doesn't just consist of such philosophical debates and explicitly philosophical themes. It also has a lot of intrigue. It has romance. It has there's a lot of trashy business going on. We meet in this article, in this chapter, 2 of the 3.5 brothers Karamazov, and the novel deals with the relationships, their complex relationships, and their particularly complex relationship with their father, who's this very lecherous, disgusting, but pretty rich old guy, right? And their relationships, and the rest of the novel focuses primarily on the relationship between the old man Karamazov and his oldest son Dmitri, who we don't see here, but they're in love with the same woman who is the local town bad girl, right? And this leads to intrigue and murder, right? So if that sounds, if that sounds interesting, but you also like your kind of intrigue and murder with a side of deep philosophical and existential longing and analysis, then this is the book for you. However, if you seek it out, please, I beg you, get the translation by Pevier and Volonkonsky. What you have in your book is the translation by Constance Garnett. She's the most common translation, so if you don't pay attention to the translator, you're probably going to get Garnett's translation. Please don't. She's notoriously dry in her translation. She was not a great scholar of Russian history or of philosophy or of religion, etc. All of those sorts of grand themes are kind of lost on her. She was the first translator of Dostoyevsky about 100 years ago. And when she didn't understand some complex reference he was making to Russian pop culture or Russian history or literature, she'd just leave it out. So we saw in the subsequent decades, especially in the 1980s when Pevier and Volonkonsky began their translation, they restored a lot of the context for a lot of the literary context of Dostoevsky's work. So I'll say more about that later. So you have a lot of reading time these days, I imagine. Go read the whole Brothers Karamazov. So, what do we want to talk about today? Well, read the article. The chapter, even though it is part of a novel, it does work as a standalone article. You can read it and make sense of it as it stands alone. And it works as a conversation, or it's presented as a conversation between the two of the brothers Karamazov. They are Ivan and Alyosha. They meet at this point in the novel. They meet by chance for dinner, and Ivan and Alyosha take this opportunity to have a somewhat in-depth religious discussion, right? So, so what do we know about what do we need to know, or what can we guess about the brothers that we meet based on how they react here? Well, in the first case, Ivan is the older brother, and he, as you might have guessed, is not religious. He has a bone to pick with religious people, in fact, and he is very intellectual and very cynical. It would seem anyway, right? Dostoyevsky, the author, is a master of presenting characters one way, but then presenting loads of psychological contradictions under the surface, right? So at first glance, Ivan is a very, very cynical person. He begins a discussion with his brother. He says they're talking about society and the suffering that people endure, and he says, it's easier to feel sorry for people if you're in theory, but when you're exposed to people up close, like beggars, you see their disgustingness, and all you want to do is get away from them. So it would be better, he says, if beggars just took out classified ads in the newspaper. They probably get more money that way, right? So that's that sounds like a pretty cynical guy, right? His younger brother Alyosha is in some ways presented as his opposite, right? Alyosha is the younger brother. He's about 18 during the events of this book. Alyosha is deeply religious. He's about to take his final vows to become a monk, right? Alyosha is under the tutelage of an older priest named Father Zosima, who is Alyosha's mentor. Zosima is Alyosha's Yoda, right? His spiritual guide, right? And Ivan wants to take this opportunity to get his brother to at least complicate his brother's thinking about making this major commitment to the rest of his life with the church, right? And what Ivan does is he presents this the problem of evil, right? And in effect demands to know from Ivan or from Alyosha. Demands somewhat rhetorically in this chapter. We'll talk about this a little bit later. He doesn't really give Alyosha much of a chance to respond, right? But Ivan's, in effect, demands that Alyosha or somebody give him an answer to this problem of evil, of why God allows suffering. And to make his case, Ivan presents this mental scrapbook that he sort of kept of all of these terrible crimes that have been committed, right? Now, being a cynical character, Ivan is not terribly sympathetic to people about the suffering that they endure. Generally, he thinks that most people are so bad they probably deserve a lot of their suffering, and most people bring a lot of suffering upon themselves. The complication is, though, that there is a certain group of people that he can't imagine bringing suffering upon themselves. He can't imagine these people deserving suffering. And these are, of course, children. He says, children before a certain age, we don't even describe them when they do wrong. We don't even describe them as bad or evil. We describe them as naughty. We have these different words for them, right? Children before a certain age are not capable of moral judgments. And yet, as Ivan points out, children suffer as much as anybody, right? And he goes through this mental scrapbook of all these crimes that he said that he talks about historically being committed against children, right? And a lot of them are famously very shocking and grisly, right? He talks about the Turks invading, I think, the Crimea, and playing a game where they throw babies into the air and try to catch them on the tips of bayonets. Right. He talks about soldiers holding a baby in front of a gun, and when the baby reaches for the gun, shooting it in the face. Right. He talks about a Russian lord who, a young boy hurts one of his hunting dogs, and so he strips the boy naked at dawn, makes him run, and sets the hounds on him, and they tear him to pieces. And of course, Ivan cynically notes, of course you have to do this in front of the boy's mother because that adds zest to the amusement, right? That makes it more fun, right? So, the other case of the girl who wets the bed, and so she's locked in the outhouse, and the outhouse floods and she drowns, right, after her parents have whipped her, and she drowns in the privy, right? And Alyosha, or Ivan rather, he works himself up into this sort of frenzy, this kind of froth, and he demands to know from Alyosha, well, why does your God, who's worth dedicating your entire life to, why would your God allow such terrible suffering? And not really giving Alyosha an opportunity to respond, Ivan proceeds to tell him, to list off the sort of traditional reasons that Ivan has heard about why God might allow suffering. Pause for a second. Okay, so what has Ivan been told about why God doesn't protect little children, why God allows suffering, and especially suffering of children? And Ivan says that he's also been raised in the church. He seems to reject the church at this point, but he's familiar with the traditional reasons given from Christians why God doesn't protect us and doesn't even protect children. And the first reason is typically that people talk about is that evil is necessary so that human beings can know good from evil and can have free will, right? So without a real choice between being able to do good or do bad, even to do good or do bad to children, human beings would not have a real moral choice and would not be able to know good from evil, right? Ivan, of course, working himself again into his lather about this, says, well, that's never made sense to him because this is about knowledge. All the knowledge in the world isn't worth the tears of that girl locked in the privy, praying for a kind, loving God to protect her. Right? If take all the knowledge in the world, Ivan says, and throw it in the can if that's the price. So he thinks that doesn't work. Now, of course, there is another very familiar, and this is not just from Russian novels, but if you have ever if you are yourself religious, or you've talked to a Christian or somebody of the Judeo-Christian, one of the Judeo-Christian faiths, about this issue. Another defense that comes up is the idea that, the suffering that we endure here, the world around us is this sort of training ground for the next life or for the end times, right? And that all the evil that is done between human beings in the end is going to be reconciled by God. Whether that means reconciliation in the afterlife, when you go and you meet with your deceased loved ones and you realize that it was all of this was for a good reason, or it means a reconciliation in some end times when the Messiah comes back and so on, right? The idea is that reconciliation will occur in the long run, and that suffering here on earth is the price we pay for this ultimate harmony, right? And Ivan, of course, also rejects this defense of God. Here come some of the most famous lines from this chapter and actually from this whole novel. Ivan says to his brother, if the price of God's harmony is the unavenged tears of children, then Alyosha, you can tell your God that I respectfully return the ticket. And here Ivan, you might have noticed this, that Ivan is not quite able to bring, he's a psychologically complex character. He seems like an atheist. He seems to be making a case for atheism, but he's not able to bring himself really to completely reject God. His attitude is not, a good God wouldn't allow suffering, so obviously God doesn't exist. His attitude is more like, if God does exist, then to hell with him. And it's clear that Ivan wants to believe in God, maybe does believe in God, but he can't bring himself to believe in God entirely or to love God, and not for the traditional sort of selfish reasons that, I don't want to worry about what I owe to God, and don't want to worry about caring about other people and doing all the things it says in the Bible. But Ivan seems to reject God out of love for humanity, out of love for his fellow humans, right? And specifically for children, right? And so it again creates this much more psychologically complex character. So Let me give the attendance password real quick. It's Einstein, Einstein, like the great physicist and scientist Albert Einstein. So Einstein. Also the bagels. I had the bagels for lunch. So anyway,
like the great physicist and the mediocre bagels.
Right, like I wouldn't call them mediocre. Anyway, back to suffering. Alyosha, of course, the spokesperson for faith, has not been given much of a chance to speak at this point, and given a chance to speak here, says to his brother, when his brother says, well, hey, if the price of heaven is that we just gloss over and we just shrug our shoulders at all of the suffering of children in this world. If the price of the reconciliation at end times is that God has created this universe that there's going to be all these children that have to suffer, then tell your God, Alyosha, that I don't want any part of that. I respectfully return the ticket. And Alyosha says to his brother, well, that's rebellion, right? Rebellion, of course, being the ultimate crime in the Judeo-Christian religion, rebellion against God, right? A crime, for what it's worth, religiously considered worse than any of the crimes against children that Ivan has just walked us through. All of those traditionally are forgivable with the right kinds of prayer and repentance. Rebellion against God, the idea that you just reject God's plan, however, is the ultimate crime, the one for which there is no hope, right? It's what got Lucifer thrown out of heaven, right? And Ivan then says, oh, okay, well, I'm a rebel then. Maybe I am. But Alyosha, let me ask you this. And he presents his brother with this final question. He says, imagine that you're creating this tapestry of human existence, this long chain of human existence. You're in God's position before he creates anything, before he creates the world. And you're going to create this long history of human beings. And the end result of that long history of human beings is going to be that everybody is going to be happy, that everybody is going to be reconciled with each other and all love each other. But the price of that ultimate harmony is that you, Alyosha, you have to torture to death one little baby, right? And Ivan says, would you agree to create the universe on those conditions, Alyosha? And Alyosha says no, and he says no softly, right? Softly because this is a moment of confusion for Alyosha. This is a moment where he is obviously pushed to in a sense give a little to the point that his brother is making. It's an embarrassing admission, somewhat embarrassing admission for Alyosha. And why is that? Well, because it seems that God, in creating the universe that God created, this world, answered yes to this question, right? Said, yes, it's going to be worth it. Yes, there's going to be a long history of children having to suffer, everybody having to suffer. But the end result of that is all going to work out in the finish. And so I will create the universe on those conditions. God, of course, is not himself at torturing to death any of these children, but he knows as he's creating this universe that he must know that the result of his creation is going to be this long chain of child suffering, right? So in this moment, anyway, Alyosha is not able to quite grasp the logic of the God that he's about to commit his life to. Okay, 2 points I want to make about this before we go is that in the first case, I always like to ask my class at this point, so imagine you're here in class. By a show of hands, how many people think, based on this chapter, that Dostoyevsky himself, the writer of this novel, is an atheist, right? Because this novel, or this chapter of this novel, rather, is just this extended squawk, this extended screed from Ivan about how bad God is, right? And it seems like the harshest kind of interrogation that we can put the Christian faith through, right? Ivan is really tying the Christian faith to a chair and trying to beat the truth out of it, right? And a lot of people just assume, based on this, that Dostoevsky was an atheist, and that Ivan is the spokesperson for the author, right? And that is not true, or at least not entirely true. Dostoevsky had a very complex and life filled with a lot of suffering, but he was a Christian through his whole. He managed to maintain his Christian faith through much of his life, and he died. He died shortly after the finishing of this novel, and he died in a state of very deep religious faith, very deep Christian faith. The takeaway from the larger novel is not that God must not exist. Quite the opposite. Dostoevsky sets his sights on resolving this problem of evil, and he does resolve it, and he resolves it in God's favor, in favor of accepting Christianity. Although, there are going to be no shortcuts here. There are going to be no pat answers to any of these questions. There are going to be no easy answers, as you might have gathered from this novel, right? The other thing I want to point out to that point about how this is just one small section of this very, very long, very complex novel. A lot of people point out, a lot of people who have faith among my students are a little frustrated by this novel, or by this chapter, that it doesn't give Alyosha any opportunity really to sort of give a kind of full-throated defense of his faith, or any sort of response. Well, the full-throated defense of the faith is basically the rest of the novel, so seek that out if you like. But for what it's worth, the next chapter of this novel continues the brothers' conversation. And the chapter ends with the brothers with Alyosha pointing out that, there is someone who has the authority to forgive all of these sins, and the person with that authority is Jesus, right, the Messiah. And that's kind of where the chapter ends, but the next chapter picks up right there, and the brothers have a discussion about Jesus. In particular, they have a discussion about a story that Ivan says he wrote in college, and Ivan goes on to sort of recount the particulars of the story. It becomes kind of a story within a story. And he describes that, the story he wrote is about it takes place during the Spanish Inquisition, right? And during the Spanish Inquisition, the Catholic Church is reigning over Europe with an iron fist, and they are torturing and murdering anybody of other faiths, anybody who's accused of witchcraft. They are really giving people no other options than to abide by their very narrow interpretation of the Bible, right? And and in Ivan's story, while the Spanish Inquisition is raging across Spain, and that the Inquisitor, the Grand Inquisitor, is ruling with his iron fist, down the middle of all of this, in this small town, Jesus appears, right? And Jesus is walking down the street. Right, and in one of the more moving passages of the book, Ivan describes how everybody just knows them when they see them, right? And so what does the Grand Inquisitor do? Well, the Grand Inquisitor does what he must do. He throws Jesus in jail, right? And then the story turns to the Grand Inquisitor interrogating Jesus and preaching at Jesus, telling Jesus how you have no authority here. You have no right to come back. You gave us your word. we are fulfilling your word and we are perfecting your word. We're doing something that you didn't have the guts to do. We are taking human beings' free will away from them. We are not giving them an option, but to abide by the word of the Bible. And so you have no authority here and no place here, right? And of course, this chapter of the Grand Inquisitor is probably the most famous chapter from this novel, probably even more famous than Rebellion, and is very often read in philosophy classes. And it in particular is an assault against totalitarianism, right? And anyway, if that sounds interesting to you, and Jesus has a very famous reply to the Grand Inquisitor. And I will leave you to discover that for yourselves. That's the Brothers Karamazov available at Amazon. This is definitely considered a necessary, essential service, especially in these times. So but I'm telling you, get the translation by Pevier and Volokonsky. So anyway, that is our discussion for today. We next are going to take another pass at the problem of evil. We're going to see J.L. Mackie explore the logical details of this problem, and he thinks the end results of this, if we really spell out all the logical details of this, we'll see that we can prove that the God of the Bible could not possibly exist, and that when you go to church on most Sundays, anytime you pray to God, Mackie thinks, well, you may as well be praying to a square circle, because that's how likely it is that God exists. Right. So, okay. Good luck to all of you, and I will see you later.